The Vietnam War, spanning from November 1st, 1955, to the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, stands as a pivotal episode of the Cold War, marked by the division between Communist North Vietnam and the anti-Communist South, supported respectively by their Cold War allies. This conflict, also known as the Second Indochina War, was characterized by a blend of conventional warfare by North Vietnamese forces and guerrilla warfare by the Viet Cong in the South. American military engagement, escalating significantly under President John F. Kennedy, was marked by a surge from less than 1,000 advisors in 1959 to 23,000 personnel by 1964. The watershed moment came with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, leading Congress to grant President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to increase military presence, thus setting the stage for widespread American intervention without a formal declaration of war. U.S. strategies included overwhelming firepower, search and destroy operations, and a strategic bombing campaign against North Vietnam, yet progress proved elusive. The Tet Offensive of 1968, though a tactical defeat for the North Vietnamese, undermined U.S. public support and demonstrated the tenacity of the Viet Cong. As the war progressed, the North Vietnamese forces received substantial aid from the Soviet Union and China, allowing them to engage in more conventional warfare and to withstand the heavy American bombardment. The United States, on the other hand, faced growing domestic opposition and a crisis of morale among its troops, leading to President Richard Nixon's policy of Vietnamization, which aimed to increase South Vietnamese participation and allow for the withdrawal of American forces. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, ostensibly ended U.S. involvement, but fighting continued between North and South Vietnamese forces. The ceasefire quickly collapsed with the Spring Offensive of 1975, culminating in the fall of Saigon and the unification of Vietnam under communist rule on July 2nd of the following year. The Vietnam War exacted a tremendous human cost, with estimates of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians killed ranging from 966,000 to 3 million. U.S. military casualties numbered 58,220, alongside significant losses from the Republic of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The war's end precipitated a mass exodus of refugees, while the subsequent Cambodian genocide and a Chinese invasion of Vietnam in 1979 further destabilized the region. Within the United States, the war led to a public aversion to overseas military involvements, known as the Vietnam Syndrome, and contributed to a crisis of confidence that permeated the 1970s. The war also caused massive environmental destruction in Vietnam, with the U.S. military's use of Agent Orange and other defoliants inflicting damage on the country's ecosystems and population. Despite the heavy human and material costs, the Vietnam War remains a topic of intense study and debate, symbolizing the complexities of Cold War geopolitics and the enduring consequences of military conflict. The narratives of those who lived through it continue to shape our understanding of this contentious chapter in global history. The roots of the Vietnam War trace back to the complex interplay of historical, nationalistic, and colonial factors. Vietnam's struggle under French colonial rule laid the groundwork for a burgeoning sense of nationalism that would eventually fuel the desire for self-determination and sovereignty. The imposition of French colonialism in the mid-19th century subjected the Vietnamese people to exploitative economic policies, cultural assimilation efforts, and political disenfranchisement. This period saw the rise of various nationalist movements, which sought to challenge the colonial yoke and reclaim Vietnamese autonomy. A significant figure in the nationalist movement was Nguyen Sinh Cung, later known as Ho Chi Minh, who founded the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930. Ho's political activities spanned across the globe, from France to the Soviet Union and China, highlighting the international dimension of Vietnam's struggle for independence. The Japanese occupation of Indochina during World War II further disrupted colonial rule, providing Vietnamese nationalists with an opportunity to assert their vision for the nation's future. In the wake of the Japanese surrender in 1945, Ho Chi Minh and his followers seized the moment to proclaim the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, igniting the First Indochina War. The Viet Minh, a coalition of nationalist groups led by Ho, launched a resistance campaign against the French efforts to reclaim their pre-war colonial possessions. The ensuing conflict was brutal and prolonged, culminating in the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where the Viet Minh emerged victorious, effectively ending French colonial rule in Indochina. The aftermath of the conflict led to the Geneva Conference of 1954, a pivotal moment that shaped the geopolitical landscape of Southeast Asia. The conference, attended by major powers including the United States, the Soviet Union, China, France, and the United Kingdom, resulted in the temporary partition of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's government was granted control over the north, while the south was placed under the authority of Emperor Bao Dai. This division was meant to be temporary, with nationwide elections scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country under a single government. However, the Cold War context and the involvement of external powers complicated the situation. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, supported the South Vietnamese government, led by Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, after he deposed Bao Dai in a fraudulent referendum. Diem's refusal to hold reunification elections as stipulated by the Geneva Accords contributed to mounting tensions within South Vietnam and between the North and South. These events set the stage for the escalation of conflict and the eventual involvement of the United States in what would become the Vietnam War. The Geneva Conference's failure to enforce its own stipulations on elections and the partition of Vietnam sowed the seeds of future conflict. The division of Vietnam was not merely a geographical line, but represented a deep ideological schism that would fuel a protracted and devastating war. The historical grievances stemming from colonial rule, the aspirations for national unity, and the global Cold War dynamics converged to make Vietnam the epicenter of a conflict that would draw in regional players and superpowers alike, leading to one of the most contentious and transformative periods in 20th century history. As the ideological battle lines of the Cold War were drawn, the conflict in Vietnam escalated from a regional struggle into a major battleground between the superpowers. The United States, deeply entrenched in the fight against the spread of communism, perceived the turmoil in Southeast Asia through the lens of the domino theory, a belief that the fall of Vietnam to communism would precipitate the collapse of neighboring countries in a chain reaction, endangering the entire region, and by extension, global security and U.S. interests. This strategic and ideological cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War justified the increasing American involvement in Vietnam. The administration of President John F. Kennedy marked a significant shift in the level of support for South Vietnam, transitioning from Eisenhower's more limited advisory and material assistance to a more substantial military presence. It was under Kennedy's leadership that the number of military advisors surged, laying the groundwork for a deeper military commitment. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 became the flashpoint that catalyzed the expansion of U.S. military involvement. Reports of North Vietnamese attacks on U.S. naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin were met with immediate action. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had inherited the presidency and the complexities of Vietnam, sought and received from Congress the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution granted him broad authority to use military force without a formal declaration of war, dramatically altering the U.S. role from advisory to active combat. It represented a crucial turning point, marking the commencement of large-scale U.S. military operations. Subsequently, the U.S. embarked on a systematic campaign of aerial bombardment against North Vietnam, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder, and the deployment of combat troops to the south. The American war machine, with its formidable air power and technological superiority, was brought to bear in an effort to thwart the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong insurgency. The American strategy revolved around attrition warfare, aimed at inflicting heavy losses on enemy forces, thereby reducing their capability to fight and forcing them to the negotiating table. However, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong displayed remarkable resilience and adaptability, employing guerrilla tactics and leveraging support from their communist allies. The complexity of the war, the challenging terrain, and the tenacity of the North Vietnamese forces combined to challenge the American military's conventional approach to warfare. The conflict in Vietnam rapidly intensified, drawing in more U.S. resources and personnel, and exerting a profound influence on American society and politics. In effect, the Vietnam War had become an arena for the ideological and military contest between the forces of communism and the proponents of capitalism, with the United States firmly entrenched in what would become one of the longest and most divisive conflicts of the 20th century. The repercussions of the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the subsequent escalation of American involvement would reverberate throughout the next decade, as the war exacted a heavy toll on all involved and fundamentally altered the course of international relations. On the ground in Vietnam, tactics and strategies varied greatly between the forces of the North, including the Viet Cong, and those of the United States and South Vietnam. The Viet Cong, with their intimate knowledge of the terrain, utilized guerrilla warfare, employing hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, booby traps, and a deep understanding of jungle warfare to their advantage. Their strategy was to avoid direct confrontations with American forces, instead focusing on small unit engagements that allowed them to inflict casualties and then disappear into the dense foliage. They also relied heavily on a network of tunnels and extensive support from the local population, operating with a level of stealth and surprise that often frustrated U.S. and ARVN efforts. The North Vietnamese Army, while also skilled in guerrilla tactics, began to engage in more conventional warfare as the conflict progressed. They conducted large-scale operations and utilized regular infantry, artillery, and armored units, especially during major offensives. North Vietnamese forces capitalized on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex logistical network that allowed for the transport of troops and supplies from the north to the battlefields in the south, despite heavy aerial bombardment by U.S. forces attempting to disrupt this critical supply line. The U.S. and South Vietnamese armies, on the other hand, relied on superior firepower, artillery, and air support in their military operations. The U.S. employed a strategy of search and destroy missions aimed at engaging and eradicating the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units. Helicopters became a vital asset for the U.S., allowing for rapid deployment and evacuation of troops, as well as close air support. However, the heavy reliance on firepower often resulted in significant collateral damage and civilian casualties, which served to alienate the Vietnamese population and sometimes drive them into the arms of the Viet Cong. The Tet Offensive of 1968 marked a pivotal moment in the war. Though militarily, the offensive was a failure for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, as they suffered heavy casualties and failed to ignite a popular uprising, it had profound psychological and political effects. The widespread attacks during the Vietnamese New Year of Tet shattered the perception of American invincibility and contradicted optimistic claims by U.S. officials, including President Johnson and General Westmoreland, about the war's progress. The images of conflict, particularly the fighting in Saigon and the siege of the U.S. Embassy, broadcast into homes across America, shifted public opinion dramatically and eroded support for the war effort. In response to the growing disenchantment with the war, the U.S. government initiated a policy of Vietnamization, which sought to increase the combat role of South Vietnamese forces while gradually reducing the number of U.S. troops. This strategy, championed by President Nixon, was aimed at building up the ARVN's ability to defend South Vietnam independently, thereby allowing for an honorable withdrawal of American forces. Over time, this led to the redeployment of U.S. troops away from the front lines and a decrease in American combat casualties. However, the effectiveness of Vietnamization was called into question as the ARVN struggled with issues of morale, leadership, and combat readiness. The war on the ground in Vietnam was characterized by contrasting methods of warfare, with the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces leveraging asymmetric tactics against the technologically superior but sometimes strategically hampered U.S. and South Vietnamese armies. The Tet Offensive became a turning point that shifted U.S. policy towards withdrawal and shifted the burden of combat onto the ARVN, a strategy that would ultimately be tested as North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensives against a withdrawing American presence. The Vietnam War was not only a battleground in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but also a site of intense domestic conflict on the American home front. The anti-war movement became a central feature of the era, as millions across the United States took to the streets in protest against what many saw as an unjust and unwinnable war. As body counts mounted and graphic images of the war were transmitted back home, public sentiment shifted. Influential movements, led by various groups, including students, political activists, and veterans, organized rallies, teach-ins, and demonstrations. This burgeoning opposition was further galvanized by events such as the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which revealed government deception in the handling of the war, and the shooting of unarmed student protesters at Kent State University by the Ohio National Guard. The anti-war movement gained enough traction to influence policy decisions, with Congress repealing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1970 and ultimately constraining further military action through legislation such as the War Powers Act of 1973. Internationally, the war's impact was significant, not least because of the involvement of major global actors like the Soviet Union and China. These communist superpowers provided North Vietnam with crucial military and economic support. The Soviet Union supplied a range of material from tanks to anti-aircraft missiles, while China sent military engineers and anti-aircraft units to repair damage caused by U.S. bombings. This support was instrumental in sustaining North Vietnamese and Viet Cong military operations. The Vietnam War had broader implications for Southeast Asia as well, contributing to regional instability and the eruption of further conflicts. In Cambodia, the U.S. bombing campaign aimed at disrupting the Ho Chi Minh Trail and targeting North Vietnamese sanctuaries destabilized the nation and played a role in the rise of the Khmer Rouge. The ensuing Cambodian Civil War culminated in the genocidal regime of Pol Pot, which led to the deaths of an estimated 2 million people. Similarly, the Laotian Civil War was heavily influenced by the Vietnam War, with the North Vietnamese and the U.S. conducting operations in Laotian territory. The U.S. engaged in a massive covert bombing campaign against the communist Pathet Lao and their North Vietnamese allies, making Laos one of the most heavily bombed countries per capita in history. The war in Laos paralleled the larger conflict in Vietnam, with the Pathet Lao eventually emerging victorious after the withdrawal of American forces from the region. The Vietnam War's legacy on the global stage was marked by its contribution to the shift in the Cold War balance, its influence on anti-colonial movements worldwide, and its role in reshaping U.S. foreign policy. Within Southeast Asia, the war's effects were profound, leaving a legacy of destruction, societal trauma, and political upheaval that would shape the region for decades to come. As the last American troops left Vietnam, the war's end did not signify a return to peace, but rather a continuation of turmoil and the beginning of new conflicts in the post-war era.